Hi, I'm Níall Fitzgerald, Head of Ethics and Governance with Chartered Accountants Ireland. As part of this governance webcast series, we will be exploring a range of topical issues, from board effectiveness, whistleblowing and speaking up, corporate enforcement and when it all goes wrong for companies and directors, and a range of business issues impacting SMEs, charities, listed and regulated companies. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel who represent members of the Chartered Accountants Ireland Ethics and Governance Committee, including Teresa Campbell, Keith Morrow and Barry O'Connell. We're going to be discussing emerging trends in corporate governance in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and especially those that impact SMEs, charities, listed and regulated companies. Teresa Campbell is Director of PKF FPM Accountants Limited, which is an all-Ireland accountancy and business advice practice, with 5 offices throughout the island of Ireland and over 120 staff. Teresa plays a key role within the audit and business advisory teams and has over 20 years supporting primarily SME businesses, with her aim being to help clients shape their strategy and achieve their desired future direction, supporting them to prosper and grow, including ensuring they have the correct governance and structure in place. Now, Teresa was elected onto Council of Chartered Accountants Ireland in 2020 and is currently Chair of the Ethics and Governance Committee, along with being on the Members Board and the Members in Practice Committee. Teresa is also very proactive in her local community, including have a number of voluntary non-executive director positions within the not-for-profit sector. My second guest joining us on this panel is Keith Morrow, and Keith works for NortonLifeLock, the cyber safety software company, leading their legal entity rationalisation efforts globally. Following qualification with Coopers & Lybrand in 1991, he has worked with a number of US multinational companies in Ireland in the financial services and technology sectors. Away from work, he serves on the board as a non-executive director of Hockey Ireland and Limerick Social Services Council. He sat on the Council of Chartered Accountants Ireland for 8 years, finishing his final term in 2020. During this time, he chaired the Strategic Communications and Ethics and Governance Committees. He continues to sit on the Ethics and Governance Committee. And my third guest joining us on this webcast is Barry O'Connell. And Barry is a partner, head of audit markets and member of the audit executive team in KPMG Ireland. He was recently appointed chair of the Audit Committee Institute and is a member of Council of Chartered Accountants Ireland. He is the Chartered Accountants Ireland representative on the Ireland for Finance Industry Advisory Committee and is a board member, Audit Committee Chair of the Crawford Art Gallery. He works with Indigenous and multinational companies with global operations headquartered from Ireland, and he's a graduate of UCC and is a member of the advisory board of the Cork University Business School. So Teresa, Barry and Keith, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. I hope to explore a number of issues given the expertise I have on this panel. We're going to hopefully look at some of the SME sector and family businesses. We're going to talk about charities and sporting organisations in addition to the governance processes overseas. And we're going to explore some issues, governance issues with large private and listed companies and the evolving role of audit committees. Teresa, if I might start with you. In addition to being a director of an all-Ireland audit, accounting and advisory firm, you hold non-executive positions including being an elected member of Council of Chartered Accountants Ireland and chair of the Ethics and Governance Committee. What are the most pressing corporate governance issues impacting the profession right now?
Thank you, Níall. And indeed, there are a number of pressing matters facing the profession at the moment. I suppose at the outset, just to outline what the purpose of the Ethics and Governance Committee is, and that's to foster an understanding and practice of ethical business issues and good governance among our members, our students and the wider business community, I suppose in the support of overall public interest and economic success. So the issues that are facing our profession at the moment, a lot of them are being driven by the government proposals that are out there at the minute that the Institute continues to respond upon. I suppose we see regularly revelations in the press in relation to corporate governance matters, the wider sustainability, which no doubt we'll come on to talk about throughout the course of today. And these, along with, I suppose, focus on technology and other issues are driving the corporate governance reforms. Another area that I'm particularly interested in is restoring trust in audit and corporate governance. And there's been significant consultations around this in the UK in recent times, and we look forward to see what the government will come out from that. And indeed in Ireland there has been recent reforms as well, and we've had the Irish Corporate Governance Gender Bill that went into Dáil Éireann in October 21, and that was around in terms of the diversity on boards.
That's right.
So a lot of matters are taking into effect around the overall corporate governance.
A lot happening in the area of corporate governance, all impacting our profession. And yes, you're quite right. The Institute is very involved in sharing the views of members and responding to those consultations. Thanks, Teresa. Keith, you've held several directorships and you're also a current member of the Chartered Accountants Ireland Ethics and Governance Committee. I know you're a sport enthusiast and you're currently a non-executive director on the board of Irish Hockey Association, as well as being an assessor for the Irish charity and non-profit Good Governance Awards. What drives you to volunteer as a non-executive director in this sector, Keith? And what do you see as the key governance challenges for charities and non-profits, including sporting organisations?
I suppose my start in this space was probably about 2008, 2009. And I was with a group of other, based down in Limerick, a group of local companies asked to go on a tour around some of the locations around Limerick where they were looking, where specific projects were ongoing. And at the end of it, we were all brought into a room and said, what can you do? And it was really looking for people to give time to get involved in an organisation. And at the time, I was invited onto the board of Limerick Youth Service, which works with younger people who've dropped out of mainstream schooling and looks to continue their education. And that, for me, was an introduction to that arena. And it was interesting. I realised very quickly the skills we have as chartered accountants and that whole understanding we have made, I was unique in the skill set on the board. There wasn't many who had that same understanding, such a depth of understanding. And I realised very quickly the value I was able to bring. And in the 7 years I was there, I learned an awful lot and realised definitely I can do more here. And before that finished, actually, then I was invited onto the board of Hockey Ireland.
And what are the types of challenges they're facing, Keith, in terms of governance issues and do they struggle with all the requirements from the Charities Code, for example? Was resources an issue? Or?
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to say. The Charities Code at the moment, between the sporting bodies, the charities, at the moment are having to give a declaration of whether they comply with the governance code. Yeah. They're on the journey or they don't comply. Mm-hmm. And it's for the steps, I suppose, company or charities have the resources to, how are we going to comply here? Do we have enough money to bring in an advisor, or do we need to work on it ourselves? Yeah. And I've been in a number of instances where they're working through that, not yet complying, but definitely getting there.
Yeah, and that's where having good input on the board can help, because you can't afford an advisor. Well, hey, you might get a voluntary board member that knows a thing or two.
And often it's the case where even his advisor is understanding, well, hang on, we're doing this. We don't have to do something special. Yeah. We actually have doing something already, and we just need to adapt it slightly.
Very good insight there, because a lot of this they're already doing. This is just formalising it, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and just documenting it so you can actually show, here it is, we're doing this.
Very good, excellent. And Barry, joining us virtually from Cork, is it, Barry?
That's right, Níall, yeah, indeed.
Well, Bart Barry, as a partner in KPMG, you are responsible for the audits and advisory services provided to many large Irish enterprises involved in financial services and multinational sectors. In your dealings, Barry, with finance directors, CFOs or CEOs of these enterprises, can you share with us some of the key corporate governance issues at the forefront of their minds?
Well, Teresa set out earlier the very long agenda that's out there in corporate governance matters at the moment. But I'm probably going to call out number one, the whole area of climate risk and how companies deal with that, both in the front end of their annual reports, but make sure it correlates with what they're saying in their financial statements and the notes to the accounts at the back. And that can be a bit of a challenge, right? And it's a fast evolving area. We see lots of new regulation coming. We see, new standard setters coming. And it's really an area of focus for companies now, both as an opportunity for many companies and how they position themselves in the market and face their customer, but also potentially mitigating threats they may have in their own supply chain or in their own operations to make sure they're appropriately dealing with that, right? So it's a broad topic, and it's one I think many companies are really getting to grips with and trying to get their head around at the moment. More close to home, I would also call out the IASA and FRC year-end reminders, calling things out to us like your COVID-related disclosures, which continues to be a factor for this year as much as we hoped it wouldn't be, and also perhaps APMs. Again, topical matter, and I know FRC and IASA both calling those out, that companies appropriately address those. And
they're two fairly, as you said, it's very broad categories, Barry. I'm sure there's a lot more detail in those two you've called out. And Barry, is it much different, because you're dealing an awful lot of global organisations? You have the situation here in Ireland. Is it similar abroad? Are we seeing similar types of governance issues abroad as we are here in Ireland? Or
Yeah, I do think so. I think some Irish companies obviously are keeping a close eye on what's going on in the UK and through that consultation process, and it'll be interesting what evolves from there. But how much of that we adopt, obviously, we were likely to adopt the EU legislative framework, right, which means we won't be taking UK legislation any longer. However, at the same time, from an FRC perspective, IASA does like to align with the auditing standards on the FRC, so it's interesting to see how that will play out over time. But I think the international agenda, everyone's grappling with climate risk. And I suppose I'm kind of caught every call I go on now, looking east or looking west, that is a key agenda topic all over the globe. And I think it's important. I think Ireland has got a very, prominent place to play, given the nature of companies headquartered here, both indigenous companies, but also multinational for their EMA operations and broader, where we can position ourselves to be a leader in that whole agenda over the next while.
Absolutely. And actually, you bring to mind a very valid point about alignment, where Europe and UK, you'd hope to be some alignment. And indeed, Chartered Accountants Ireland have been very outspoken in terms of supporting aligned global sustainability reporting standards. So I think most organisations are globally minded these days. Teresa, you, like many chartered accountants in practice, provide valued services to SMEs and entrepreneurs across Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. Are similar issues described by Barry on their minds, or is corporate governance such a live issue for them?
I think, Níall, the points that Barry have raised are all very relevant for all businesses, regardless of size. However, the regulatory reporting that will be required, obviously, for the smaller business is going to be that little bit less. But for owner-managed business, I mean, none of us could have ignored the COP26, for example, recently in relation to and all of the press surrounding that and all of the requirements that all businesses are going to face. But I think good governance for any business is important, and particularly to have the framework right for how decisions are taken, for example. Yeah. And any client I'm talking to at the moment, and even in our own business, in terms of attracting and retaining staff, that is so important. So to be able to demonstrate that you have good governance in place, I think is very, very important, and particularly around sustainability and protecting the business for the future generations, I think is all particularly very, very relevant for any business today.
And I think that's actually a very, very, very strong one there, more so than probably what comes out of COP26, the narrative there. But for small businesses, we look at sustainability in two ways. It's the way that the business itself survives, and also in the way that it manages its impact on the environment or whatever social issues, and that the impact on them is limited as well. And I think from a small business perspective, succession is quite an important issue. And I think you said it, Teresa, is attracting...
Yes, attracting and retaining staff, and I think it's protecting the business today for future generations. So it's to be able to pass on the business to the next generation, but equally to ensure that the right framework is there to do that. Yeah. So that may be around structure, it may be around decision making, it may be around labour culture within an organisation is also so important. So I think if you ask many small business today, they may not think they have corporate governance framework in place, but in fact, when you strip that back, they absolutely do, because it's the foundation of their business.
It's back to what Keith said earlier on, in terms of they're doing this stuff. This is just governance is just formalising it. I like what you say about the decision making as well, because it sometimes it can be awfully difficult to make some decisions. Having a framework in place there to help you make that decision will
absolutely. And we live in a society at the moment, Níall, where we only have to look at the press and you just see the issues that are out there around corporate governance. Yeah. And I think, Níall, for many businesses today, the most important point that they should be asking themselves is, should I do this? Should I take this decision? Whereas a few years ago, it may be, can I do it? Yes, I can. Yes. Now it's actually, should I do it? So should I do this with the right governance in place?
That's certainly a very strong point. Should I rather than can I? Keith, your current professional role involves working with legal entities across the world as part of a rationalisation project for a large multinational. Now, I'm sure this provides you with interesting insights and the opportunity to compare corporate governance practices across jurisdictions. Are we that different in Ireland and Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the world when it comes to corporate governance?
Oh, I think you're looking at a whole catalogue of different attitudes to governance in the different countries across the world. Without it, like Latin America has its own culture. You'll find parts of Europe then are much stricter. I would say, looking at the Asian countries, it's very compliance-based, a lot of rules. Like, if anything, actually, the most recent COVID experience has actually brought a lot of jurisdictions where you now can do an e-signature. Before that, you had to have a blue pen in signing it. If it was a black pen, it got rejected. So actually, being allowed to do little things like that It's actually, I think, one of the positives that come out of the COVID.
So a lot of other governments have moved towards virtual AGMs,
Yes.
accepting virtual
They're
signatures.
accepting that.
Okay.
Telephone meetings were often allowed.
Okay.
But there are still countries, I'm just thinking one, Egypt at the moment,
Yeah.
where you have to be there in person.
Okay.
And that presents its challenges of its own.
Okay, absolutely, yeah. So you'll be visiting the Great Pyramids in the near future, Keith. Corporate governance reform is on the global agenda. And this is evidenced by discussions at G20 in relation to the Pandora Papers and anti-money laundering, evidence at an EU level with current proposals in relation to corporate directors' duties and audit reform, and the UK with recently published corporate governance and audit reform proposals, including the establishment of a new regulatory body, Audit Reporting and Governance Authority. Ireland is not immune to reform. And as a group, I would be interested in your views or expectations for corporate governance reform in Ireland and UK, and if the legislation or regulation decision makers were listening, what would your one ask be from them? And I'll first put that question, if I may, to Barry.
Yeah, Níall, it's an interesting question, right? I think through the best consultation process, and I was involved in a few submissions around this, there's actually quite a bit of good in there, right? And it is looking to move the agenda forward, move the agenda along. If you pick out, the ask of an audit and assurance policy and that to be disclosed in your reports is actually a good thing, and it brings it all together, right? And you see the proposal maybe where Arga would interact with audit committees. And even we have that already in Ireland, where IASA would now meet the chair of the audit committee as part of the inspection process. So I think in some ways we were a little bit ahead, and it'll evolve. So I do think we need to be proportionate, though. It's probably my one ask for the regulator, if I can just touch on that. In that I was around when SOX came in first in the US, and it was brought in at a very detailed level. And if I look at the UK proposals at the moment, US SOX is a more sensible proposal now with getting the right outcome. And that's what I'd look at the regulator to be proportionate in their response as to what they might bring in around the area of internal control and what they're asking directors to do, and how that is assured then by the auditor. So lots to think about.
Of course, and that's a very important word when it comes to corporate governance, is proportionate, Barry, because we talk about proportion in the context of what's fit for the capital markets and the large listed companies, but also right down the line in terms of what's proportionate for SMEs as well. And with that in mind, actually, I might go to you, Keith. What would your views be on?
It's funny you say that. Barry brought me back to the SOX environment.
Yes.
And I remember the first reviews we would have been doing in our company, and we had far too many controls. Then that word key
is there such a thing, Keith?
Yes, there is, absolutely. When you're working on the coalface, there are too many. There can be too many. Well, so identify the key ones. Yeah. And in fact, we look at all these years later, and the key controls are still there. They're still being used, and they're still being adhered to. So I think the proportionate message is very strong and the right one to give.
Segregation of duties and all that good stuff.
Of course, yes, absolutely.
And Teresa, from the SME perspective?
Yeah, I think, Níall, I'll have to echo what Barry and Keith have said, is proportionate. If you want to bring small business owners along and engage in them, it has to be relevant to them. There is so much legislation for small businesses to deal with. We've just come through Brexit, or we're still in Brexit and trying to sort that out for so many businesses on the island of Ireland. And I think if it is proportionate at a level to bring the SME along, then they will adhere to it. Otherwise, it will go, to be honest, it will go over their head, and they won't deal with it.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so you said it there, Teresa. There's so much legislation, regulations to comply with. Even if you're just a coffee shop, the amount of licenses you need and procedures you have to go through just to open your doors, between employment legislation, tax legislation, health and safety authority, food safety authority, etc., and what the internal controls we're talking about is putting frameworks in place to help you manage all of that. So corporate governance, in terms of proportionate, is actually a high bar already.
Absolutely. And I think what so many small business owners can take from it, if they've got chartered accountants working with them, or either internally or as their external advisor, is that so many accountants are advisors or non-exec directors on other organisations. So they're bringing that experience to the SME, which I think is very valuable as well.
Sustainability has been referenced several times in this discussion, and I know from my involvement with Accountants Europe's Corporate Governance Policy Advisory Group that more requirements for sustainability governance as part of the EU Green Deal are inevitable. While some of these requirements will initially apply to large private companies, listed companies and entities operating in certain regulated markets, they will eventually impact all businesses. As business leaders in your own areas, what advice can you offer directors and owners of businesses to practically address sustainability in their governance processes today? And Teresa, perhaps from an SME perspective, I could start with you there.
Sure, yeah, I'd mentioned earlier, Níall, in terms of sustainability of an organisation and that whole area of succession planning, and I think that's very important that business owners take on board sustainability. And for example, if you want to attract staff, and I'll go back to this issue again because it's an area I'm very passionate about, you have to understand what their ask is. And so many of our young people, as they come for interview, are talking about climate, they're talking about sustainability. So I think that all of us have a responsibility to play, regardless of the size of the organisation. And it's those small steps, and it's appreciation that those small steps, maybe it's driving electrical vehicles, maybe it's doing a little bit more for the climate, and putting in place those policies and procedures can add significant value collectively.
And Teresa, can I ask, does it cause some SMEs to question what they're doing and whether this is sustainable in the future? In the context that, and again, I just draw a reference to a business I'm familiar with, is the supplying of furniture and special needs equipment. There's actually a call out from schools and Montessori's out there that they want to be buying less plastic, more sustainable products. So it causes some companies to change their
I think it does. I think you're absolutely right in terms of, and there's responsibility on all of us to do that for all businesses. And I think that pressure or peer pressure, possibly, there will be a little bit of pain now as we look for different suppliers or that in terms of, but I think ultimately every business has a responsibility to do that and should embrace that.
And of course there is the rising cost as
well.
The
rising cost as well, yes, indeed.
Absolutely. Keith, what is your perspective from the global perspective? I mean, from the supply chain, perhaps businesses supplying into larger companies, that are larger companies looking for.
Well, I think they're probably you're going to find the larger corporates looking back down the supply chain, absolutely, to make sure that the practices of their suppliers are adhering to what's expected, and it may become a criteria for selection of suppliers going forward as well.
And indeed, that is actually one of the areas European Union is looking at the moment, bringing in duties for a corporate to manage the supply chain for sustainability, with specific emphasis, I believe, at the moment on proposal, I should say, to make sure that any supply you get does not involve forced labour. So it seems to go in that direction. And Keith, may I also ask you, from a charity not-for-profit perspective, does sustainability matter?
No, and it actually, the word that Teresa, you said a moment ago, succession planning.
Yes.
I think for organisations that are looking, say, even voluntary organisations, to make sure they do have people who are willing to take over. You don't want to leave the same people at the helm too long. It's not good governance. You need to look at your continuation of maintaining the right skill sets on the boards.
See.
And then I think also, as you take a step forward, organisations, transparency is becoming more and more. And I think that's where whole stakeholder engagement comes in. You've got to have the communication flowing around. Take a sporting organisation, keeping the communication open with your members all the time, seeking their feedback. I think it's very important.
And of course, I mean, when we talk about sustainability, we can't lose sight of the fact that sustainability is a broad phrase, and we focus a lot on climate change because it's urgent and important, but sustainability also involves social, and charities, sporting organisations, they're going to be very strong on the social on the social front. Barry, it's all happening at the large private and listed company stage. So I won't ask you to explain how you embed sustainability in those large organisations, but perhaps you might give us a kind of flavour for what's happening in that area.
I think, Níall, maybe taking it from a practical perspective, and I'd agree with the remarks made by Keith and Teresa, right, wholeheartedly, and I think it applies in the large companies and the PLCs as much as it does at the charity level and the SMEs. You need to get someone who's responsible within your organization and allocate responsibility for it, right? And I would encourage people then to baseline and understand where they are, because I think then you can move forward. And I think it's also important to understand, where you are, and if you're operating in many territories, can you get the information? Can you get access to the data? Is the data consistent? I know many organizations are grappling with those questions at the moment, right? Because if you look at the last round of trading statements of the PLCs, Níall, probably half of the trading statement is at non-financial or ESG type indicators, as much as they're talking about their numbers. So that's only going one direction from what I can see across the public market, right? And that's something that people need to be agile and adapt to. And then maybe I also believe, and I've seen this at one large PLC recently, sustainability and climate and ESG were important, but recently they've started to allocate capital and included that whole agenda in the scoring mechanism. So you won't get capital allocated to your next project without actually having, being in the right place and being in line with the targets the company set itself. And there's only going to be more of that, right? So what's your framework? Who's responsible? And maybe can you do a maturity assessment or get someone to help you or do a health check as to exactly where you are, set your baseline, and then decide how you're going to move it forward? Just some practical steps, perhaps.
And Barry, there's some debate at the moment about sustainability committees and whether every company should have one or whether sustainability should be embedded in the work of other existing committees. What are you seeing? Are many PLCs having sustainability committees, or what's the direction of travel there?
I think the ideal objective over time, Níall, would be to get it embedded in the business. It's management responsibility, right? But I think to get up and running and get started, and so much of this is new, it's quite confusing actually what's out there at the moment. How do you interpret it actually? And I see a lot of merit in an organization-wide committee coming together initially to decide the company's approach and kind of setting the tone. But I think ultimately you'd like to see this as being management and employees' responsibility throughout the organisation.
And Barry, I'm going to stick with you. I'm not picking on you, so forgive me, but just because we're talking about committees, I don't actually recall a previous time when the role of audit committees has been such a focal point for corporate governance reforms and sustainability. And I suppose in your capacity, Barry, as chair of KPMG's Audit Committee Institute, how do you see their role evolving to meet the requirements of various stakeholders' expectations on these two areas? And I know you mentioned IASA and FRC's involvement earlier, but...
Yeah, I just, Níall, the agenda continues to expand, right? And I think some of the challenge is actually making sure you keep the agenda within a certain tramlines and you stick to that, right? Because otherwise you might never stop. I think it's important, though, do you have the right skills on the audit committee? And I think it now would be timely to reassess. Do you have climate or ESG type skills for some of these new areas? And that's going to be a challenge. And it's a limited supply of people, I think, that probably have that. And I see some diplomas coming out recently that I think will be useful, or how people get accredited in this area over time. Are you making the right challenge of the board on these points and having that right discussion? And have you agreed as an audit committee, what's your process around these areas to look at them over annually and how you'll revisit them? I think you'll need to be able to adapt and change quickly because what you were looking at last year actually on some of these agenda items has moved on very significantly over 12 months. And, maybe as a related point, if 2 years ago someone said to you, you should be planning for a pandemic and what your first month response might be, you might have got a few strange looks around the table. That now is a very live conversation among many companies as to, on a particular issue, what will you do in the first month or the first 24 hours of a cyber event if that happens to you? It's no longer theory, it's very, very real. So for audit committees, it's in summary, well, actually, what are we looking at and what management is looking at is important. And then have we the right skills to be able to make the right challenge of management? I think that really is audit committee's role, fresh perspective, external perspective to the group.
And to one of your points, Barry, is it fair to say that audit committees need to be closely aligned as well and communicating with the risk committee? Because a lot of those things you highlight are managed by the risk committee.
Yeah, very much so. And actually, Níall, it's a good example, actually. I think the role of audit committees on some of the areas around climate is probably where the risk agenda was 10 years ago. It was just starting out, a bit embryonic. Now you've got risk committees, you have a chief risk officer in many boards, even outside the financial services regulated area. And I think that's where it's going to evolve to on some of these other topics over the next while as well. So very important that audit committees are aligned with risk. And they are ARCs. They're audit risk and risk committees, combining the roles.
Fantastic, Barry. Keith, you back to the charity not-for-profit sector. You may not have chief risk officers working in the organisation, but again, a lot of chartered accountants will find themselves on the board of a charity or not-for-profit and find themselves chairing the audit committee, or at least a member of the audit committee. What are the types of issues that they're dealing with in that?
Well, I think at the moment, actually, the organisations that are involved in have a finance, audit and risk committee.
Oh, wow.
So they've combined it all together.
They're a mini board. Is that...
Yeah, well, perhaps, yeah, the governance has gone to somebody else, so that's okay.
And Teresa, these are important issues for the entire profession. Is there anything we should be aware of in context of?
Yeah, and I think for SMEs, Níall, it's very important that they take the good practice of the larger entities. And I mentioned earlier in terms of board effectiveness and how decisions are taken. So to learn the lessons of the larger corporates, I think is very relevant for for SMEs, and to have, for example, have a risk register. They may not have a separate audit committee, but to do some form of internal audit, because the cyber issues that the larger organisations are facing, they're day and daily in the SMEs as well. So it's so important that the consequences of those are really known and are tried to prevent against.
And a large organisation might recover from a cyber attack. A small organisation could be the ruin of them.
Absolutely. I'm sure we could all give examples today of clients that we know that have gone through this, and it's trying to then put in place good practice and better practice for them to try and mitigate those risks further.
Just one other point I wanted to make about audit committees, or rather ask you if I may, and it's the fact that when you look at Ireland and Northern Ireland, we are like a mecca for large multinational companies, which means we have a lot of group subsidiary companies operating here. Is the role of an audit committee of subsidiary any different, especially in relation to their ability to ensure that audit findings are followed up at group level? And I guess, Keith, I'd go to you, maybe Barry, on that one.
I suppose I remember when this came in for an Irish company I was a director of, and we actually looked at the responsibilities and felt they were covered within the executive and by our main audit committee. But nevertheless, we took it on ourselves to make sure we were compliant, making our filings on time. So there was that whole period when we had to make a director's compliance statement. So what you literally did was go down through all the different legislative items that were impacted your company and worked out, well, what are we doing to make sure that we're complying with those? And then you got the input from the actual executive teams, and you captured that in your support of your director's compliance statement.
Did you have anything to add there, Barry?
I think Keith's response, I think the most important thing is lining up what you're doing locally versus what's being done at group. And in many cases, we see that group do cover all the responsibilities. Clearly, where an entity is regulated, though, they are required to have an audit committee in Ireland. And, it's also, if the nature and size of the business is different in Ireland than the global business or a particular type of business, it may well be appropriate that you'd have the local audit committee in addition to the group one. But it really is, it depends on the circumstances in front of you, I think.
Barry, Keith and Teresa, thank you very much for your time on this webcast. It just goes to show, you're all members of the Ethics and Governance Committee, and we're just talking about the governance aspect of that committee. We're not talking so much about the ethics, and there's an awful lot happening in the area of corporate governance reform. I have no doubt that 2022 is going to be a very busy year when it comes to corporate governance, but thank you for giving your time and for talking to us today. Thank you for watching this governance webcast production by Chartered Accountants Ireland. And you will find more useful resources on our Governance Resource Centre at www.charteredaccountants.ie/governance. The Resource Centre is regularly updated with events, guides, articles, corporate governance news, and contains links to other useful resources, for example, technical updates or the latest on ethics via our Technical or Ethics Resource Centre. Make sure you are signed up to the weekly Chartered Accountants Ireland e-newsletter and stay tuned for the next Governance webcast production. Thank you.